While most knew the Watts as a happy couple expecting their third child,
Mommy has a baby in her belly.
the Thayers say Shanann suspected infidelity. Court documents also show the pair filed for bankruptcy.
Investigators are going to know whether or not he had a girlfriend, how deep financial trouble he was in, whether he wanted to be alone and being a parent was just too much for him.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime.
In this episode, we'll be dealing with the third biggest what the F moment in the Chris Watts case. You may recall that in the previous episode, we dealt with the grisly and grotesque disposal of the poor little girls' bodies in the oil tanks, but also sort of the idea of treating people like garbage, the idea of thinking of people as something to throw away, right? In a way, today's episode is going to take that narrative further with the idea of money and debt being a sort of a natural mirror to crime and murder, and the idea of disposing of living things, just as one disposes of things every day that you feel like you don't need. But obviously there's something grotesque about doing that with a living person, with any person, but particularly grotesque in terms of family, children. In this episode we're going to be going through the finances of the Watts family, but kind of in a way that hasn't been done before. Some people have commentated sort of focusing on the numbers. This is how much was owed, and others have sort of disputed, he said, she said, Shanann earned a lot, whatever. We're going to be going through it in a different way. We're going to be going through it through referencing the discovery, and then referencing other aspects that where one can use logic and common sense. And then we're also going to tap into an area that I think people are going to find quite fascinating, which is the sort of psychic connections to money that we all have. This idea that money is God and that it negotiates immortality for everybody. But we see this in particular with the Watts case. We see it with Shanann through her Thrive, and with Watts trying to hold on to money so that he could have his happily ever after. So we've got quite a lot to get through. In the meantime, if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. Please like and leave a comment, and let's get started. Now, compared to the first two, this may not seem very surprising or shocking, and that's maybe the most shocking aspect of all, is that the money narrative is a huge thundercloud that becomes basically a hurricane when you get all the information. It was a huge hurricane swirling over the Watts home. That enormous house, probably the biggest house in the whole estate, was basically dwarfed by the enormous roiling clouds of debt over it. And the reality is that that home was actually a house of cards. It was a house of cards built on a house of cards. It was a house of cards built on Shanann's house of cards. It was also a house of cards built on Chris Watts' house of cards. The amazing thing to me was when one went through the discovery, and because it really was an idea broached that they knew they were living beyond their means. The Watts family themselves knew they were living beyond their means, and so when Chris Watts broached the subject to his wife, she wasn't surprised, she wasn't angry, she wasn't resistant, she wasn't trying to talk him out of it. She knew that they were living beyond their means. And there's actually a text sent to, I think it was Nicole Atkinson, maybe Cassie, where Shanann's kind of in the middle of the battle to save her marriage. This was on around about August 9th, and she was struggling to hold things together. And within that context, she said Chris wants to move to Brighton. Just matter of fact. That's actually a really big deal, leaving your house, downsizing. And Shanann was completely resigned to it. The same Shanann that we see on all those Thrive videos, talking up how happy she was, talking up how great everything was, talking up how everything was perfect the way they were. Meanwhile, they weren't. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, they needed to sell the ranch. Their whole lifestyle needed to change. And that's really kind of the essence of the what the F that we want to get at. Of course, when you just say it, one doesn't get an idea of the scale and scope of all of those videos, day by day, really selling an illusion, selling a lie that one can live large, one can have the perfect life, one can have things exactly the way that you want them. Meanwhile, you can't, and that's the whole Thrive BS that was sort of infecting everybody else. Everyone recycling the same stuff. So quite amazingly, we kind of almost get the most insight and the best insight into the What's Money narrative from Nicole Kessinger. We also get insight from Shanann's Facebook, as I've mentioned. We also get a little bit of insight, very little in fact, from the district attorney, and we're going to go into each of those in turn. But let's start with Nicole Kessinger. So through Nicole, we're basically getting a bird's eye view of the Watts family finances via Chris Watts. So instead of Shanann sort of saying, this was how my husband spent money, this was my husband's attitude to money, this was what was going on, you've got a third party giving kind of an independent view, maybe not completely independent, but certainly separate from the Watts couple themselves. And this person is giving a specific idea of how specific money was spent, for example, on her. And you have this interesting situation where Chris Watts seems to have almost this sort of chivalrous attitude in terms of he's now going to pay for all their meals. I don't mean it in the sense that that's abnormal and that a man shouldn't pay for the meals, but this was actually a situation where he had no money and their credit cards were maxed out, and they were in a situation early in the relationship where they were eating out together, and I'm sure he wanted to wine and dine her, he wanted to woo her, but it seems he really took charge of the finances when they went to eat out. Again, you might not think this is strange, but Watts was kind of a guy who would take a step back. He wasn't in charge of the finances at home. He didn't know what the bank accounts were, if you want to believe that. And yet in this scenario, he's taking charge. He knows how much the meals cost. He's ready and prepared to cover whatever the costs are. Even so, he's kind of got a sneaky way of doing it. He's paying for everything using Anadarko gift cards. And as I say, the scale and scope of this gets quite enormous. But this is an early symptom showing us that something's rotten in Denmark. The fact that Watts is paying for all these meals with gift cards allows him to sort of fly under the radar. If he makes a purchase, Shanann's not going to be alerted to it. But it also means he's kind of got to premeditate it. He's got to find ways of allocating finances or cards to himself in advance so that he can cover for himself, that he can conceal for himself. And in a way, this is a mirror for the secret calculator app where things are hidden in plain sight in that app. And so the Anadarko gift cards are another way of seamlessly and in a fairly simple way paying for things that he shouldn't be allowed to pay for, that Shanann would jump on his back if she found out. In this way, it's invisible, and she's not aware of it. Nicole said she wasn't certain how Chris got the gift cards, but believes that they were given to him by Anadarko as a bonus for being safe on the job. He must have gotten quite a lot of bonuses because he took her out quite a few times. We do know that on the occasion of the very last meal they had together, he had basically run out of these gift cards. We know that very last purchase was done on a credit card, and exactly what he'd been trying to avoid all this time then took place. Shanann was alerted. And this is in the discovery where Nicole said that Chris had been using the gift cards to hide their relationship from Shanann. So it's deliberate. And that was obviously something that played in Kessinger's mind is if you're leaving your wife, why do you need to hide our relationship? If she's leaving you, if she's not interested in the marriage, why do we need to pretend? Why can't you tell her about me, kind of thing. And then the discovery goes on to say that Nicole noticed on August 11th, this was basically a day before the murders, that Chris paid for the meal with a baby blue credit card. And during this time, what's made it clear to Nicole, he was filing for divorce from Shanann. And it's quite interesting that in the context that what he's saying is definitely filing for divorce, it's almost like he's making this purchase with the card as if to prove that, as if to say it's okay that Shanann knows about this because we are getting divorced, right? So it's almost as if he's providing reassurance or assurance to Nicole that the processes are underway, that he knows they're getting divorced, and so does Shanann. The reality is Shanann doesn't know, but he has made up his mind. The reality is on August 11th, Watts is quite far into his premeditation and planning, and is quite certain of what he's going to do. And we do know that 24 hours later, the first murders did happen. So Nicole says in this part of the discovery that she thought it was unusual for Watts to pay with a credit card because he'd always used the gift cards, and she believed Chris had nothing to hide anymore from Shanann, so he was not concerned with paying with a credit card, that Shanann might be able to see the transactions. This is a fascinating little insight here, but I'm not sure whether Nicole is being completely forthcoming here. It may be that she wanted to come first in the relationship, and she wanted to come first then and there. She wanted him to pay for her then and there with a credit card. She wanted kind of proof that having come back from North Carolina, things were really over. And it could be that it came from her side. It could also be that Watts wanted to prove that he meant what he said. It could also be that Watts didn't really care if Shanann knew, and he maybe he resigned himself to it. Maybe he thought, I don't want Shanann to know, but if she does know, well, if she starts telling her friends that she's concerned and then she disappears, wouldn't those pieces of the puzzle go together? In other words, if she talks to a friend about is he having an affair, and then the next thing she disappears, maybe she was upset about that, and if her friends knew about that, would that really matter? My gut says that he would rather not have let Shanann know about that, and that he did that more to placate Kessinger. That's my personal opinion. I'm not sure if Watts was asked this by Cadel or anyone, but it would be interesting to know what actually went down there. But I've got an idea Kissinger isn't saying as much as she possibly could in terms of that. When she says she believed Chris had nothing to hide anymore from Shanann and that he was not concerned, I think he did have something to hide and he was concerned. So whether he was pretending he had nothing to hide and that he wasn't concerned is another factor altogether. So that's one really interesting insight. And what this also shows is that Watts couldn't afford just a simple meal out. And we know that because when Shanann was alerted, she noticed the amount and quickly jumped on it. And she interrupted her life and her dinner to Google restaurants and to Google prices. And that doesn't show a family who are living large and having a great lifestyle in a mansion with an expensive car. It shows a family highly compromised, highly sensitive to the smallest charge, whether it's for parking or an extra beer at a restaurant or whatever. Shanann was certainly not in the financial position to sustain these excesses, right? So if we go to another aspect from Nicole Kissinger, this is also from the Discovery. She says that if she was not in Chris's life, his family might still be alive, but not permanently. And so what she seems to be saying is that if she wasn't a factor in this equation, he would eventually have done what he did anyway. And that's a very interesting comment that she's making there. In other words, she's saying later on in the same thing, she does say that she was a trigger for what happened. She says she believes that being in Watts' life accelerated the process, and the process being the mad decision to wipe out his entire family, right? She says she accelerated the process, but she doesn't think she's the only catalyst for this event, and I agree with her with that. I think when she says that if she'd not been in his life, his family would have been alive, but not permanently. So what he's saying is, at some point, even if she wasn't in the picture, the sort of financial downward spiral would have driven him to do what he did, because that's where they were going. They were going to lose their home, they were going to lose everything, and the stress was becoming unbearable. Nicole accelerated that stress and exacerbated it as well. I mean, she was an expense as well. Obviously, in a way, her argument benefits herself. In a way, her argument lets herself off the hook. But another argument one could make is, if the Watts family had enormous wealth, if they really were very, very wealthy, would the murders have been necessary? And that's certainly an argument for another time. I think the pregnancy becomes a factor in that argument. But again, from Nicole Kissinger, we get the insight that according to her, Chris and Shanann didn't get along well, and their financial life was also troubling. So I think there was a personality clash somewhere along the line with Watts and his wife. She became more controlling, and he became more sort of almost of a coward. He became more controlled, and a big aspect of this was their financial life. According to Nicole, Chris was struggling with finances, and she didn't know how they could afford another kid. And he must have known that as well. He must have known he can't afford another child, and he certainly can't afford an affair and another child. And all of this together, I think, the affair and the pregnancy, I think, brought the financial reality into kind of a sharp focus. Because you may be casual and relaxed about your debt when things are sort of just carrying on as normal, but when you're in an affair, or you want to have a relationship, or there's something that you desire greatly, but you can't have that, then you suddenly realize that you are in serious financial trouble. There's something you really want, but you can't have it. And then you realize, well, the debt burden is the problem. And yeah, you get a really interesting comment again from Kissinger where she says Shanann was not responsive to this financial trouble. In other words, what you're getting is this situation where she's in control, but she's not responding. He's becoming more aware of the trouble, but he's stuck. He can't seize control. He can't respond. And in other words, so the trouble's gonna get worse, and he is becoming more and more stuck in the situation. And as you take that narrative further and further, you see how, where you say, well, why didn't they just get divorced? The divorce would be the divorce would continue that financial narrative, right? Whatever problems they were in, the divorce would perpetuate them. And so for whatever reason that he felt stuck in the situation, the murder was a way of getting unstuck, getting rid of the debt and the money problems that he saw in his entire family. He saw it in Shanann, he saw it in the pregnancy, he saw it in his children. Not the children in and of themselves, but in terms of their exorbitant medical costs and in terms of their schooling and all that kind of thing. And when you start to see people not as people but as expenses, it's not a very long route from there to seeing them as garbage and disposing of them as garbage. If you have a vehicle that is costing you more than it's giving you, then you want to get rid of it as well. Something that is so useful to you, it's an object, but it's so useful to you, but then it becomes expensive, and then you want to get rid of it, and it becomes like garbage. Some people just leave their vehicles somewhere, and that's how they get rid of them. A vehicle, something that is of value. I know when I lived in South Korea, this was quite well known, that people would just abandon their vehicles. And I don't think there was much of a second-hand vehicle market in South Korea, but it was quite an interesting mindset there, that where you have people who, as soon as they flick a switch and they say, well, this thing no longer has value to me, it suddenly doesn't, just through that sort of decision. And it's a financial mindset. It's not so much anything else. And so what's also interesting is, compared to Shanann and Chris Watts, Nicole was very financially stable. Nicole had her stuff together, right? She was, and I think this is a moment of truth, a moment that sort of resonates, where Chris said he didn't know a woman like her existed. I think that's true. I think he was so used to Shanann doing what she did, and he didn't really understand it, and he thought it was how all women worked. And there are a lot of women that are like that are very high maintenance and so on, that want the best outfits and that spend a lot and that are voracious after their husband's income. We know this from a excellent article in the Daily Beast, where a former employer, Gregor Law at Longman Ford, where both Shanann worked and Chris Watts, said that he witnessed that when Watts got his paycheck, he gave it straight to Shanann, and even so they were living paycheck to paycheck. So the fact is, when Watts met Nicole and they got to know each other, I think the fact that she was financially stable was an attractive aspect. The fact that she seemed sensible about money, given his horrible situation, was a pleasant surprise. And then to sort of wrap up this aspect about Nicole Kissinger, she felt, according to the discovery, that money was the biggest catalyst for the event happening, for the crime happening. I'm not sure whether that's true. I think it could be true. It's definitely something where one can argue it from a couple of sides. Nicole Kessinger herself could have been the biggest catalyst, but certainly an argument could be made that it was the money. I certainly tend to think it's a much bigger deal than what most people do, and I think that most people seem to think that Shanann was earning a decent income. I don't believe that. I think she was either not even breaking even or losing a lot of money. I think she had proportionately a lot to deal with the debt of the family. And there are many reasons to say this. I don't want to get into that because I know people will jump onto that and say, no, she was earning a lot of money. It comes back to the typical classic statistics with multi-level marketing, which I've dealt with before. For me personally, one of the biggest what the F moments in this entire case was when the district attorney said that he didn't think the money was a big deal. And I think a lot of people have cottoned onto that and said, well, he's the authority on this case, and so he must be right. And so that's a fact. And it's not. It was his opinion really early on. And I don't know whether he knew as much about it as he should have. And I don't know whether he knows as much about multi-level marketing as he ought to have. But let's just go through the press conference where a reporter asked the district attorney a question about why. So ironically, where it comes to motive, and this is also something that Kessinger addresses in her answer, where she's asked, why do you think this happened? And she's talking about catalysts. She cites money as a very big factor. And so now you have a reporter kind of asking the same thing, and then the district attorney mentions money. And so the question the reporter asked was, she says, I know you don't know why exactly, and at this point Rourke nods, sniffs, purses his lips, but can you talk about what the motive was or the reason for it? And at this point Rourke abruptly looks down, and the reporter continues, or the reason for a seemingly normal father to do something so horrible. Rourke then answers, but before he does, he gazes down, he purses his lips, and this is the answer he gives. Like I said this morning, and he's gazing into the middle distance. Ren is in picture, glancing up at him, the deputy district attorney. He says, I think that based upon his Google searches, his cell phone searches, some of the things he was doing while Shanann and the girls were in North Carolina, I think it became pretty obvious that he found a new love interest. And for whatever reason in his mind, he blinks, divorce wasn't an option. So he basically saying that he thinks it's pretty obvious that he found a new love interest. That's why he committed the crime. It's not the answer, because people have affairs all the time. That's not why they commit crimes. In any event, Rourke goes on to say, and for whatever reason in his mind, and he blinks, divorce wasn't an option. He says, I can't speak as to why, and he shakes his head, anyone would take the steps that he did, but during the course of our investigation, other than the normal stresses of financial stress that I think most of us have, the occasional marital stress, we couldn't find anything else that was a significant enough motive. And then he gazes up and to the right, glances back at the reporter and says, to annihilate your family in the manner that he did. So in a weird way here, Rourke is kind of saying, I can't say why, other than the normal financial stresses, but he says most of us have that. So he's kind of saying, I can't say why. He mentions the finances, but then he says they're completely normal. I don't think they were completely normal. I think Rourke is wrong in this respect, in many respects. I think he's wrong because the Watts were living larger than most people given their finances. So if you just take the neighborhood they were living in, that big brown house was bigger than the houses on either side, and you could sort of go down the road, and it was still bigger than pretty much most of the houses in that estate. There were some houses behind that were certainly pretty big, but just kind of looking down the road, up and down the road, and so on, that house was certainly one of the bigger houses. And if you look at what these people were doing, that they were, Watts is basically a mechanic or an oil worker. His wife was selling powders and shakes. They shouldn't have been living in that house. They shouldn't have been driving that car. Their children shouldn't have been going to the school that they were in. They shouldn't have been living in the neighborhood they were in. They shouldn't have been going on trips. They shouldn't have been flying around the country. They shouldn't have been on Facebook saying, I'm going to buy this Tesla or whatever it was. They shouldn't have been going to San Diego or to, exotic holidays. And so they weren't having normal financial stress by any means. And that's an aspect that I get the feeling Rourke either misunderstood, or maybe he was just trying to not draw attention to for whatever reason. But there was, the fact of bankruptcy 2 years earlier, and then you build this big house. There was the fact of such financial difficulty that Shanann's parents lived with them for 15 or 16 months in the basement, and it wasn't a pleasant period, and it looked like even her parents were in financial difficulty. It looked like even they were trying to sell their house during this time. And so you have quite an extended quagmire of rotten finances, or even non-existent finances. You can even extend it to some extent to Watts' side of the family, his parents in Spring Lake. When you look at their house, it's a very modest little home. When you look at the Russek's home, it's a very modest little home. Shanann's mother is a hairdresser. Her father makes furniture or fixes furniture. Watts' father is a mechanic. And so these aren't wealthy people. They sort of blue-collar people. And yet, from these respective backgrounds, somehow Shanann and her husband got it into their heads that they could live as large as they wanted to. And I think the multi-level marketing played into this psychology and made them think, if you just say it, you can have it. If you just fake it till you make it, right? And look where things ended. Jodi Arias did the same thing, faking it till she made it, believing in the secret, believing in, if you say things that can conjure reality. Well, it doesn't. It conjures feces. It conjures garbage. It conjures not money in the way that money should be, but money as a burden, as debt, as death. And if you think of money in that sense, money as something that, if you think of money, you go to work and then you get paid. That money you're getting is almost for the death, the sacrifice of your time, your labor, your energy, your physical work, where you'd rather be doing something else. You get money in response to sacrificing your life at a particular job. And if it's a horrible job, like even like a job where you're risking your life, the mountaineers that climb mountains, and they get big sponsors, but they're risking their lives, and then they could die. If they don't die, they come back and they reap rewards and they get bigger sponsors. You have the same with racing car drivers. You have the same with certain mine workers working in hazardous conditions, certain oil workers working on rigs in the North Sea and in the polar regions in very hazardous conditions. The Ramsey ransom note is a typical example of money for your life, but it's bogus, of course. It's, I'm going to give you money, and that and then I'll give you your daughter back, in that situation. There is a real interchange between the idea of money and the person. We see it with women who, like in 50 Shades of Grey, where if this guy was poor and he was doing what he was doing, the woman would run a mile. But the fact that he's a billionaire suddenly makes everything wonderful and sexy and all this kind of thing. I want to come back to the psychic connections we have to money. And when you look at it, a guy called Ernest Becker, who's an incredible commentator on the human condition, he refers to the idea of money being God because it negotiates immortality. and he says that money doesn't symbolize feces but the denial of feces, and it represents physicalness, animality, decay, and death. In other words, what money tries to do is it tries to transcend our animality, our decay, our limitedness, and if the body gives off things like feces, which connect us to the limitedness of our bodies and the decay of our bodies and death, what Becker refers to as material repellents. And what could be more repellent than feces? And we see feces in this case, where what's killed his wife, and the living fetus is expelled almost like feces, and feces themselves are expelled. But how can you transcend feces and death? Well, with money. If you can accumulate enough gold and buy your way to greatness, that's exactly what Watts wanted to do. He wanted to accumulate the gold of the house and buy his way to a more expanded life with his mistress. And within that symbolic theater, what he was doing made complete sense to him. What he was doing in that symbolic theater was rational, and he knew what he was doing and he wanted to do it. But we aren't in his theater completely. To some extent we are, because we've got our own relationships to money. But from the outside looking in, what he was doing made no sense, and it didn't make much sense to Kissinger either. But it's because we're not intuiting his situation through the symbolism of money. So the whole idea of money as a way to transcend death isn't new. It is well known. The connections of money to motive are very well known. In fact, in true crime. In fact, I would argue that you could take any person, you could take yourself, and take what you do on a daily basis. In fact, a lot of what we do, sadly, a lot of what we do on a daily basis, and say, how much of that isn't motivated by money? The things that attract us to other people, how much of that isn't based on their economic circumstances that suit us and where we want to be with ours, right? I just want to quote from Sidney Homan's book Shakespeare and the Triple Play, where he says, and I know it sounds like a really complicated statement, but you should maybe just think about the word slowly and maybe play this back once or twice to get what he's actually saying, because it's this kind of studious examination of the Watts case that's really fascinating, and it's missing from the commentary. I realize it's, to some people it'll be gobbledygook and it's not what you want to hear, but just hear me out. This is from Shakespeare and the Triple Play by Sidney Homan, and he's really referencing Ernest Becker here, and he says, and I quote, "The compulsion to deny death and the body acts as a philosopher's stone to transmute base feces into the gold that can purchase immortality." End quote. I'm going to read that again, and while it may seem like Greek, it might seem like another language, when I read it, just think about it in the basic sights and sounds of the Chris Watts case. Think about feces, gold, and immortality in the scenario of fairy tales, death, nightmare, and debt in terms of Chris Watts, Nicole Kessinger, and Shanann, right? You don't need to understand the words perfectly to understand how this relates to what we're talking about. And when we do this, we are going beyond the conversations that a lot of the others are having. This is where we're getting to true crime rocket science, and we're getting into the real rocket science aspect of criminal psychology. Not just the psychology of the criminal, but also how that bleeds into everybody else. Okay, so I'm going to read it again, and just open your minds to all the pictures and the theater that was going on in Frederick, Colorado. Again, I quote, "The compulsion to deny death and the body acts as a philosopher's stone to transmute base feces into the gold that can purchase immortality. And what we get, end quote, and what we get through this simple sentence are quite a few little interesting sentences and interesting words like the compulsion. Who had compulsions in this story? What were these compulsions? What did Shanann have a compulsion to spend? Did Chris Watts have a compulsion to want to have sex? Did Nicole Kessinger have a compulsion to want to be first? And if you take those statements and you link them to denying death, each one of these people are denying death in their own way. Shanann is denying possibly her past and her own ill health and her own limitedness and her own maybe husband who's not loving her the way that she wants. She's denying that by going on to Facebook and telling the world of how happy she is and having another child and spending. And that's her way of denying death in her unique way, right? And her unique psychology. Chris Watts is losing weight and is having an affair, and he's also spending money on eating out, and he's telling lies, and he's wanting to not have a child and wanting to not have a family. And these are all ways that this man sees to deny the constrictedness and obligatedness of his life. And then you have Nicole Kessinger, and she is denying death in the sense that she's not thinking about the fact that this guy's got a family, and she's maybe not fully aware of his financial circumstances, and she's not fully aware of what's going on. And even when he commits the crime, she's in denial that it's serious. She's in denial that maybe they have just gone missing. Maybe she did lose her temper and just left. She's also in denial. And so it says the compulsion to deny death and the body, right? And the body, the compulsion to deny the body as well, acts as a philosopher's stone to transmute base feces into the gold that can purchase immortality. All three of these people are trying to purchase immortality. Some of them through pretending that there's no debt, some of them through pretending that they are thriving, some of them through pretending that they aren't in a marriage, but all of them are trying to purchase immortality. And that's what's quite fascinating in terms of the whole debt money debate, because all of us in some way are trying to get out of our limited lives and live bigger, better lives, and money allows us to do that, but only to a point. In the end, money can't buy us immortality. It can buy us the idea of immortality, but money can't literally buy us immortality. Do you see that? So if we go back to the discovery, I just want to run through a couple of other what the F moments. The fact that Chris Watts couldn't log in to check his own bank accounts because his wife does the finances. He knows the password but not the username. It's difficult to know what to make of this. Is it true? Did he really not know the bank accounts? I doubt it. I think Shanann was in control, but I think towards the end Watts was catching up and he was figuring out how bad things were. While Shanann wasn't home, Watts could open their mail and see where things were going and do the math, and I think he saw that the math wasn't adding up. He wasn't going to be able to carry on living like this. And he must have made the decision that he doesn't want to move with Shanann to Brighton. He wants to start his own life and build things again, because this is the second bankruptcy, and the bankruptcy he must have blamed on her. We go to another aspect in the discovery, and it just refers to the cards, where I think it's Officer Coonrod asked Chris if he'd looked through Shanann's wallet to make sure all her cards were there. And then he answered, he said she has different cards than him, and he doesn't know how many she had. I mean, that tells you as well that he wasn't keeping track, or maybe he wasn't allowed to keep track of all the different cards that Shanann was getting. Another aspect in the discovery refers to just the wallet on the on the kitchen counter with multiple bank and credit cards. I've got one credit card. How many do you have? Is it normal to have many bank cards? Interestingly, at the same time that bank cards were found, Shanann had nausea medication. And then just to touch on the My Prepaid Center, another way that Watts sort of dodged leaving a money trail was that he used a little trick where he preloaded a card with money, and he did that using myprepaidcenter.com. I think you preload a Visa card, and so you can still pay with a card, but it's through that scheme. We see that a couple of times in the discovery. At one point, the guy responsible for the phone data review, so it was FBI Special Agent Kevin Hoyland that analyzed the GPS and cell phone data, and then it was also Amanda Purcell, who is the evidence record supervisor involved in the phone data review that compiled it. I think it was Hoyland who said that he visited the prepaid center website, and he refers to it as a service that promotes a 5% cashback incentive when used at preferred merchants and services universal prepaid Visa cards. Although not all of the references to My Prepaid Center are mentioned, the phone data reviewer does mention the words "as he's off to do," that Watts frequently visited My Prepaid Center. It's strange that they wouldn't provide every instance, but there certainly are 3 individual instances in the discovery. Another one is at 8 o'clock, at 8 o'clock on July the 26th, and another one on July 29th at 20:36. So I want to wrap up this particular episode just by talking about the fact that you never heard from the Wattses themselves. I'm talking about Shanann didn't tell other people that she was in financial difficulty, and I think those people she did tell didn't want to tell anyone else because they were thrivers. So you have some people saying that they were completely unaware that there were any difficulties, and then you have others who were aware but they're not letting on, which is amounting to the same thing. It's kind of a conspiracy of silence. When Chris's boss was asked whether he knew anything about Chris's financial situation, he said no, he didn't, but he said he did know that their children had been very sick over the past few years, and Watts had talked to him about the stress it put on him and his wife. What's amazing is you have a guy like Detective Baumhover entering the Watts home and immediately realizing and suspecting, correctly as it turned out, that they were having serious financial issues. He literally walked into the house and kind of thin slices everything and realizes these people are struggling financially. It's from Detective Baumhover that we get the words, that they appeared to be living beyond their means, and that's exactly what they were. They were living well beyond their means. And if you take those words literally, and I want to end off on this particular point, if you take those words literally, that you're living beyond your means, it means that you can't. It means that you cannot sustain a particular lifestyle. And in this case, the can't sustaining a particular lifestyle ends in death. It ends in a baby that doesn't come to fruition, a baby that dies, a baby that is essentially birthed in soil, in a grave. It ends in children disposed of, turned into garbage. And all of this has its root in living beyond their means. If you want to turn your fairy tale into a nightmare, start living beyond your means and see where that life ends. And in this sense, perhaps in more way than in any other sense, the Watts family are a cautionary tale, not only for the neighborhood that they lived in, not only for Colorado, not only for America, but for the world. It's what happens when you are lying to everybody else about your life, when you're living the appearance of something when underneath your life is much, much worse, but you apparently can't bring yourself to be honest about what's really going on, and so the nightmare gets worse, the deceit gets worse, and who you're really lying to is no one but yourself. And from these lies, the fairy tale drifts further and further away, and the nightmare gets deeper and deeper and darker and darker, and the hole that one is falling down, the sort of Alice in Wonderland hole, it just becomes without a bottom. And how do you get out of that? And in a weird way, the world we're living in is a world living beyond its means. We are running out of resources as a world. The life on this planet is being whittled down, and we are living as if there's no tomorrow. And what happens when you live like that? Eventually there is no tomorrow. And this whole idea of living beyond your means is that there's some way that you live at someone else's expense. You live at, you cash in someone else's chips, or you borrow from somewhere or whatever. But at some point you reach the point where there's no more. You reach the point where there are no more gift cards, and there is no money left in the bank, and the chips are down. The cards have been dealt, and it's all over. And part to me of the disaster here is this idea of trying to be perfect, and trying so hard to give the world out there to sell them the lie of happiness and of some kind of fairy tale, and in the end it's a nightmare. And in a weird way, we're all complicit in this lie. We're all lying to each other on social media. We're all making out that we are better than we are. Our profile pictures and our sentiments are all hidden behind avatars, and the real us are fatter, older, balder, lousier, more indebted, more compromised, more dysfunctional than we're letting on. And everyone's so caught up in talking up how great everything is. We don't want to give ourselves a break and say, you know what, things aren't that great. You know what, I did make a mistake. You know what, things aren't perfect. You know what, I don't want to be in this relationship anymore, it's not working out. You know what, my life isn't as rosy as it seems. Things aren't really that great. You know what, I think my husband's having an affair. I don't think he loves me. You know what, I think those parents, my parents aren't treating me the way they should, or I'm not treating them, whatever. Nobody's perfect, and yet people get caught up in this lie of that they're thriving, that things are wonderful, and everyone wants to be those people, except not even they are living that lie. And that is perhaps the biggest what the F in this whole case, and the fact that we're not so aware of it maybe points to a what the F related to us. In any event, thanks for listening. A lot of these aspects are discussed in the Two-Face series. It's called Two-Face for a reason, and part of how we intuit and we negotiate the reality of who these people were is where we acknowledge our own flaws, and we become human beings again. We don't look at Chris Watts as a monster, but as a person, as a man. And through doing that, we realize we ourselves are also fallible, and we need to put up our socks. We need to sort out our debts. We need to pay the piper, and we need to get our acts together. And we only do that by taking a full, hard look at things that are going on in another case like this, in the Chris Watts case. And true crime allows us the space and the safety to look into another scenario, and how good are we at dealing with reality? How good are we at seeing reality? How good are we at looking into this experimental situation, this almost hypothetical? How good are we at seeing objective reality in that? And it is a test. It's a test to see how good we are at at recognizing what's authentic and what's not in other people. And when we can do that, then we at least have a chance at seeing what's wrong in our lives and making it right, seeing what's inauthentic in our lives and becoming authentic people ourselves.
Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.